The mansion stood at the edge of town, its silhouette outlined against the setting sun. Ivy crawled up the walls, and a creeping mist from the surrounding woods seemed to linger in the air, wrapping itself around the estate like a blanket. The windows were dark, their glass streaked with years of neglect. Yet, there was something about the place, something compelling. The air seemed charged with a silent promise of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Emily stood at the grand iron gates, her breath catching slightly. She had inherited the mansion from a distant relative, someone she barely knew. But after her sudden passing, Emily had become the unlikely beneficiary of the crumbling estate. "You sure you want to do this?" Mark, her friend and longtime confidant, asked, his voice hesitant as he stood next to her, his brow furrowed with concern. "I've heard things about this place. Strange things." Emily turned to face him, her expression firm, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. I need to know more. This is part of my family's history. I can't just let it go." They stepped inside, the iron gate creaking loudly as it swung open, and the mansion loomed larger before them. It was more magnificent than Emily had imagined, despite its state of decay. The front steps were cracked and uneven, the door heavy with age. Inside, the air was thick with dust, as though the house hadn't been disturbed for decades. A musty scent clung to the walls, and the floorboards groaned with every step they took. The mansion's grand foyer stretched out before them, the chandeliers hanging like forgotten relics from a past era. The staircase, a towering, spiraling structure, led up to shadowed halls above, where dim light flickered through the cracked windows. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow Emily and Mark as they moved deeper into the house. "This place is eerie," Mark muttered, his voice hushed. "I don't like the feeling of it." Emily didn't answer. She was already focused on something else. An odd, unsettling sensation that seemed to be seeping from the house itself. The house felt cold despite the warmth of the afternoon sun outside, and a silence hung over everything, thick and oppressive. They explored the ground floor, finding room after room filled with cobwebs, broken furniture, and remnants of a once glorious past. There was an old library lined with leather-bound books, some of which were crumbling from age, their pages fragile to the touch. In one corner, a piano stood, untouched for years, its keys coated in a fine layer of dust. Emily wandered through the mansion with a mixture of awe and unease. She was determined to find something, anything, that would tell her more about the mansion's history and the relatives she had never known. It wasn't until they reached the back of the house that they encountered something strange. A door. It was small, almost hidden behind a thick tapestry of faded crimson fabric that hung against the wall. Emily's eyes were immediately drawn to it, though it seemed no different from the other doors they had passed. But there was something about it, something off. The way it didn't quite align with the rest of the walls, the way it seemed to beckon her without saying a word. "What's this?" she murmured, more to herself than to Mark. Mark looked over her shoulder. "I don't remember seeing this one in the blueprints. It's not listed." "That's because it's not on the plans," Emily whispered. She could feel her heartbeat quicken, a fluttering sense of curiosity mingling with unease. It wasn't meant to be found. She reached for the door's old brass handle, but before she could turn it, Mark stopped her with a hand on her arm. "Wait, Emily," he said, his voice low, urgent. "We don't know what's behind that door. It's not worth it." She turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "You're scared." Mark frowned, stepping back a little, his eyes darting to the door and then back to her. "I'm not scared, but I've heard stories. My mom used to talk about this mansion when I was a kid. She said there was a room here that no one talked about. People who went in never came back the same. Some even disappeared. "That's just a rumor," Emily said, shaking her head. She couldn't dismiss the excitement bubbling inside her. "It's probably just an old storage room or something." Mark hesitated, casting a final uneasy glance at the door. "Maybe, but there's something about it that doesn't feel right." Ignoring his protests, Emily twisted the handle. The door creaked open, a rush of stale air filling the room beyond. She stepped inside, Mark following reluctantly. The room was small and dimly lit, with the only source of light coming from a single, cracked window on the far wall. It was filled with dust, the air thick and stale, as if it had been sealed off for a very long time. The walls were lined with strange, faded tapestries, depicting scenes that Emily couldn't quite make out in the low light. There was a large, wooden chest in the corner, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to pulse faintly as she gazed at them. And then there was the sound. It started as a faint whisper, so soft that she thought she might have imagined it. But then it grew louder, a murmur, like voices speaking just out of reach. The words were indecipherable, but the tone was unmistakable. Urgent, pleading, almost desperate. Emily turned to Mark, her heart racing. "Do you hear that?" Mark nodded, his face pale. "I do." "What is that?" The whispers grew louder, as though they were coming from all around them. Emily's breath hitched as the room seemed to grow colder. Her skin prickled with an icy chill, and her heart pounded in her chest. Suddenly, the air shifted, heavy and oppressive. It felt as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. Emily stepped back toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, the whispers intensified, the voices becoming clearer, almost insistent. "Leave now before it's too late." Mark's hand gripped her arm. "We have to get out of here." But before they could turn to leave, the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The whispers stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. And that was when Emily realized something had awoken in this house. Something ancient, something dark. The room had never been meant to be found. And now, they had unleashed something that would never let them leave. The room felt different now. The walls, once silent and still, seemed to breathe around them. The air was thick, heavy with something unseen, something suffocating. Emily's chest tightened, her heart hammering in her ears. The whispers that had once been soft and distant had now turned into an oppressive presence, pressing in on her from all sides. Mark stood next to her, his hand still gripping her arm, his eyes wide with fear. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. It was as if the house itself had swallowed their voices. All they could hear was the beating of their own hearts and the pulse of the whispers that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Emily swallowed hard, her throat dry. "We need to get out," she whispered, her voice shaky. She reached for the door, her fingers trembling as they gripped the cold handle. But as she tried to turn it, the door refused to budge. "Locked," Mark breathed, his voice thick with fear. "It's locked." Emily's mind raced. The room had been sealed for years, perhaps longer. But why had it been locked? And why was it open now? There was no answer. Only the whispers. "Leave. Leave now." The voices were clearer now, sharp and desperate, like a warning. But Emily couldn't move. She felt rooted to the spot, as though the very walls of the room were holding her in place. The chill in the air deepened, and the floor beneath her feet creaked in protest. "We need to leave, Emily. Now." Mark's voice trembled, but Emily didn't respond. She could feel something stirring in the air, a presence, something ancient, something powerful. The room seemed to pulse with life, its very walls alive with a sinister energy that threatened to swallow them whole. As she stood there, frozen in place, Emily noticed something strange. In the corner of the room, the chest that had once been just a forgotten relic now seemed different. Its surface, once dull and covered in dust, now glowed faintly, as if an unseen force was calling to her from within. "Emily, don't!" Mark cried out as he saw her take a step toward the chest. He pulled at her arm, but she couldn't stop herself. Something was drawing her to it, something that felt beyond her control. The whispers grew louder still, now becoming more insistent, more urgent. "Open it! Open it before it's too late." The words were clear now, as if they were being spoken directly into her mind. Emily's hands reached out, trembling, toward the chest's heavy lid. She hesitated for a moment, but then, as if a force beyond her own will had taken over, she lifted the lid. The moment the chest opened, a wave of cold air rushed out, stinging her skin and stealing the breath from her lungs. Inside, nestled in the shadows, was something that took her a moment to understand. It was a book, ancient and weathered, its pages yellowed with age. The cover was black, cracked, and embossed with symbols she couldn't decipher. But it wasn't the book itself that made her heart skip a beat. It was the way the pages seemed to move on their own, as though the book was alive. She reached out to touch it, her fingers trembling. The moment her skin made contact with the pages, the room seemed to exhale. The whispers stopped, leaving a deafening silence in their wake. But something was wrong. Emily felt a surge of dread, like a deep, gnawing fear that rose from the pit of her stomach and crawled up her spine. It was as if the house itself was watching her, waiting for something. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from somewhere deep within the house. It sounded like something had fallen, or maybe something had broken. Emily's heart raced. She slammed the chest shut, but the damage had already been done. The room seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy, and the temperature dropped even further. Emily and Mark looked at each other, their faces pale, eyes wide with terror. "What was that?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. Before Emily could answer, the door creaked behind them. Slowly, almost impossibly slowly, it opened, just a crack enough for a sliver of light to spill into the room. Emily and Mark both turned to look, their breaths caught in their throats. The light that filtered into the room was strange, flickering, as though it came from a distant source. It didn't feel natural, felt wrong. The whispers began again, but now they were different. They were no longer warnings or pleas. They had become mocking, taunting. "Too late! Too late!" Emily's pulse quickened. She turned to Mark, but his face was twisted in fear, his eyes fixed on the door, his body stiff. "Mark," she whispered, but he didn't respond. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated, as if he were staring at something only he could see. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she followed his gaze. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall and shadowy. Its form was indistinct, but the eyes were unmistakable. They glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and Emily's blood turned cold. "Mark!" she shouted, shaking him by the shoulder. But he didn't move. He just stood there, his body rigid, as if frozen in place. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, its presence making the air thick with dread. It was as if the room itself recoiled from it, the walls closing in, the very floor beneath their feet sinking. Emily felt her knees weaken. She had to run, but she couldn't move. She was paralyzed, trapped in the room with whatever this thing was. The figure took another step forward, its glowing eyes locking onto Emily with an unblinking, chilling gaze. And then, the whispers returned, louder now, a chorus of voices, all chanting in unison. "She is the one." Emily's mind reeled. What did that mean? What was this thing? She could feel the air growing heavier around her, as if the darkness itself were consuming the room. The figure's steps were slow, deliberate, and with each one, the temperature dropped further. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she felt the room closing in, the walls pressing in from all sides. Mark stood motionless, his eyes still locked on the figure, his face drained of color. His lips parted, as though he were about to speak, but no sound came. And then, with a sudden, sharp movement, the figure reached out its hand. The figure's hand was cold, colder than anything Emily had ever felt. It hovered in the air, just inches from her face. She could feel the darkness swirling around it, like a suffocating cloud pushing against her lungs. Her heart raced, and her body refused to move. It was as if her very soul was locked in place, caught between fear and a strange sense of inevitability. The figure's eyes, glowing with a dim, unnatural light, locked onto hers. They were empty, hollow, and yet full of an ancient, insidious power that sent a chill crawling down her spine. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body betrayed her. It was as if the room itself had wrapped her in chains. The whispers began again, louder this time, their tone twisted with mockery. She is the one. The key. Mark stood beside her, still frozen, his eyes wide, unblinking. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. His body was stiff, as though he had become part of the room, part of the thing that watched them. Emily reached for him, desperate to break through the terrifying trance that had taken hold of him. "Mark, please, say something," she whispered, her voice barely audible, her throat dry, but he didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the figure in the doorway. Then the figure moved. Slowly, it stepped closer, its long, shadowy form slipping through the door like smoke. The air around it seemed to grow colder with each step, the temperature dropping so rapidly that Emily's breath became visible, a thin mist rising from her lips. The figure reached out a hand, not to touch her, but to reach past her, as though it were beckoning her to follow. "Don't!" Emily gasped, backing away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls felt closer, as if the room itself was shrinking. She could feel the weight of the air, the pressure building around her chest. The more she tried to move, the more she felt trapped, as though the very space around her was closing in, suffocating her. Mark's eyes flickered, and for a moment, he seemed to come back to himself. He turned his head to Emily, but his expression was blank, empty. "Emily," he whispered, his voice weak, as if struggling to speak through the fog of terror that gripped him. "We shouldn't have come here." His words were broken, and his voice trembled with an overwhelming fear that mirrored Emily's own. But before she could respond, the figure's hand shot forward, not to touch, but to grasp the air around them, as if pulling the very shadows towards them. Emily's breath hitched in her throat. The darkness swirled in the room, thickening, growing heavier with every passing second. She could feel the pressure on her chest tightening, her lungs struggling for air as the figure drew closer. It wasn't just a presence anymore. It was something that wanted to consume them, to pull them into the black void of its power. Suddenly, the room went completely still. The whispers stopped. The air froze. Emily's heart pounded in her ears, louder than anything she had ever felt. It was as though the world had stopped moving, and she was suspended in time. The figure, still shrouded in darkness, had paused, its eyes never leaving her. The temperature had plummeted to an unbearable level, and yet the figure seemed untouched by the cold. Mark stood beside her, shivering now, his hands trembling at his sides. The fear in his eyes was raw, desperate. "Emily, we need to leave," he said, his voice cracking. "This place. It's not right." Emily turned to him, her own fear mirroring his. "I know, but how? The door, it's locked. We can't get out." Mark shook his head, panic rising in his eyes. "There has to be a way. There has to be something we can do." But before Emily could respond, the figure's hand moved again, this time reaching directly for Mark. Its fingers stretched out, long and claw-like, reaching through the air as though the darkness itself was an extension of its will. "Mark, no!" Emily cried, but it was too late. With a sudden, forceful motion, the figure's hand made contact with Mark's chest. The moment it did, a shockwave of coldness swept through the room, knocking Emily off her feet. She hit the floor hard, gasping for breath as the world seemed to tilt around her. Mark staggered backward, his body convulsing as though the very life was being drained from him. His face contorted with pain, his mouth open in a silent scream, his eyes wide with terror. The figure's grip tightened, its shadowy fingers digging into Mark's chest. The air thickened with a sense of suffocating pressure, and Emily could feel the very walls around her closing in. It was as if the room itself was feeding on their fear, growing stronger with every moment that passed. "Mark!" Emily cried, crawling toward him, her hands reaching for him. But the darkness was everywhere now, swirling around her, pulling her back. Mark's body jerked violently, and then, with a final, heart-stopping jolt, he was released from the figure's grasp. He fell to the ground, gasping for air, his eyes wide and filled with terror. But there was something different about him now, something empty. His skin was pale, his face gaunt, and his eyes held a distant, hollow look, as if the life had been drained from him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His lips moved in a silent plea, but nothing reached Emily's ears. And then, with a sudden, terrifying clarity, Emily realized that Mark wasn't the same. He wasn't Mark anymore. He was something else. The whispers, now louder and more insistent, filled the room again. They were no longer distant or faint. They were everywhere, inside her head, in the air, in the walls, in the very ground beneath her feet. Too late, too late. She is the one, the key. Emily turned toward Mark, but he was no longer looking at her. His vacant eyes were fixed on the darkness, his body stiff, as if controlled by some force beyond his own will. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the air vibrating with an energy that made her head spin. "Mark," she whispered, reaching for him again. But this time he didn't move. He just stood there, staring into the abyss of the room, his body frozen. The figure moved again, its glowing eyes never leaving Emily. It stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating her. "You will join him soon," the voice whispered, low and rumbling, as if it came from the very walls themselves. "And then, we will all be free." Emily's heart thundered in her chest. There was no escaping now. The room had claimed them, the house had claimed them, and the whispers, they would never stop. Emily's breaths were shallow, every exhale like a slow, fearful whisper. Her heart hammered in her chest, thudding so loudly it drowned out all other sounds. Her eyes darted around the room, trying to make sense of what was happening. Mark stood motionless beside her, his once lively eyes now empty, staring into the nothingness of the room. His face was pale, his skin almost translucent, and his lips quivered as if he were trying to speak but couldn't. The air felt heavy, like the very walls were pressing in on her, suffocating her from all sides. The oppressive silence was deafening, broken only by the low hum of distant whispers that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. "You will join him soon," the words echoed through her mind, and she fought to push them away, but they clung to her, swirling like dark smoke. She couldn't ignore the feeling that the room had shifted, that the walls were alive, watching, waiting. The thing in the corner of her vision, the figure that had stood in the doorway, was gone, but its presence lingered, like a shadow that refused to leave. "Mark," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she reached out for him. He didn't respond. His head was tilted slightly to the side, and his gaze was still locked onto the dark corners of the room. There was no recognition in his eyes, no sign that he could hear her. It was as though he had been completely taken over by the house, by whatever malevolent force had come to claim him. Panic gripped her chest, but she fought to keep it down. She had to do something. She had to find a way to break whatever hold the room had on them. Suddenly, Mark's body jerked, his eyes blinking rapidly as though he were waking up from a deep, restless sleep. But when he looked at her, there was nothing human in his expression. His eyes were glassy, devoid of emotion, and his lips curled into something that could have been a smile, but it was twisted, unnatural. "You're still here?" he rasped, his voice hoarse and dry, like a man who hadn't spoken in years. "It's too late for you, Emily. It's already begun." Emily stumbled back, her heart racing. "Mark, what's happening to you?" she gasped, her voice desperate. "What do you mean? What's begun?" Mark's face was pale, his features sharp as though all the life had been drained from him. His once familiar face was now a mask of terror, twisted by an unseen force. "The room. It calls to you," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You shouldn't have come. You never should have come." The walls seemed to pulse around her, the air thick with an unnatural chill. Emily felt the weight of his words sink in, like a stone dropping into the pit of her stomach. She wanted to run, to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The room had closed in on her, trapping her in its dark embrace. "Mark, please," she begged, tears welling up in her eyes. "We need to leave. We need to get out of here. We can't stay in this place. It's wrong. It's not safe." But Mark just stared at her, his vacant eyes unblinking, as though he were a stranger in his own body. The room seemed to draw closer with every passing second, the shadows deepening, wrapping themselves around her like a web. Then, without warning, the floor beneath Emily's feet shifted, a low creaking sound filling the air as the room seemed to breathe. The walls seemed to close in tighter, and the temperature dropped even further. It was as if the house itself was alive, reacting to her fear. The whispers grew louder. "She is the one. The key." Emily's blood ran cold. She felt a deep, terrible understanding settle into her bones. The room wasn't just a room, it was something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. She shook her head, desperate to reject the thoughts that clawed at her mind. "No," she whispered fiercely to herself. "This can't be happening." Mark's voice broke through the haze. "The room will never let you go. It feeds on fear, Emily. You're already a part of it." A sudden realization struck her with the force of a blow. The figure she had seen before, the one in the doorway, it wasn't just a ghost or a hallucination. It was something else, something far worse. And Mark, he was no longer the person she had known. He had been consumed, twisted by whatever dark force had taken root in this place. But Emily wouldn't let that be her fate. Not yet. She couldn't give in. She looked at the door again, the same door that had been locked when they first tried to escape. It was still closed, the key still out of reach. But she couldn't stop herself from moving toward it, her legs shaky beneath her. She had to try. There had to be a way out. Mark's eyes followed her, a flicker of something dark crossing his face. "Don't," he whispered, his voice barely audible, as if he were begging her. "You'll never leave. Not unless you accept what it is, what we are. But Emily didn't stop. She reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling as she grasped it. She turned it slowly, almost afraid that it would break under her grip. But the door didn't budge. It was still locked. She tried again, but it felt like the house itself was pushing against her, resisting her every move. The whispers grew louder, and Emily felt something, an unseen hand, press against her chest. The room was alive with the sound of her fear. Then, with a sudden rush, the door flew open. The dark hallway outside was empty, silent. The air felt colder, and the shadows stretched long and twisted, reaching for her. But she didn't hesitate. She stepped forward, one foot into the hallway, then the other. The room behind her seemed to pulse with an angry, violent energy. But Emily kept moving, her heart pounding. "Emily, no." Mark's voice echoed behind her, but she couldn't turn back. She couldn't stay in that room any longer. As she walked down the hallway, she felt the darkness closing in on her, the walls stretching and distorting as if the house itself was shifting, changing. The whispers still echoed in her ears, the promise of something terrible waiting in the shadows. But Emily didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. There had to be a way out of this place. There had to be a way to escape. Emily's heart raced as she stepped into the cold, silent hallway. The house felt like it was alive, its very walls pulsing with dark energy. The whispers, faint at first, now grew louder, more insistent. She could hear them in her ears, behind her, even beneath the floorboards. They were everywhere. "She's the one." The voice slithered through her thoughts, chilling her to the core. She stopped, her hand still gripping the doorframe, frozen in place. The world around her seemed to shift, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, as if the house itself was watching, waiting for her to make the wrong move. Mark's voice echoed from behind her. "Don't run. You can't escape." Emily clenched her fists, refusing to turn back. She had to keep moving, had to keep searching for a way out. There was no other choice. She couldn't stay in this place, trapped with whatever nightmare lurked within it. Taking a deep breath, she stepped further down the hallway. The floor creaked beneath her, each step louder than the last. The air grew colder, heavy with an oppressive force that made her skin crawl. She felt as if the darkness was closing in, squeezing her chest with invisible hands, but she pushed forward. The hallway stretched ahead, endless and twisting, like a maze of old wood and forgotten memories. The walls were lined with portraits, their faces faded and cracked with age. Their eyes followed her, unblinking, but she refused to look back at them. She had to focus. She had to get out. Suddenly, a door loomed in front of her. It was different from the others. The wood was blackened, charred as if it had been burned long ago, and the handle was rusted, barely hanging on. It looked wrong, out of place in the otherwise untouched hallway. But Emily felt an overwhelming pull toward it, like it was calling her name. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the cold metal of the door handle. A shock ran through her, a jolt of icy terror, but she didn't pull away. She twisted the handle, and with a loud creak, the door slowly opened. Inside was a room unlike any other she had seen in the mansion. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scrawled in dark, twisted ink. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of decay filled her nose. At the center of the room was an old wooden chair, its backrest cracked and worn. It sat beneath a single flickering light, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. There was something in the chair, something that made Emily's stomach churn with dread. A figure, hunched and motionless, sat facing the wall. She couldn't make out its features, but she knew, deep down, that whatever it was had been waiting for her. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her, urging her to step inside. Emily hesitated, her heart pounding. The air was thick with dread, but she couldn't leave without understanding what this room was, what it had to do with the house and its secrets. With trembling hands, she stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind her, and the light above flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. The shadows seemed to grow, stretching, twisting like living things. Who's there?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible in the oppressive silence. No answer, just the sound of her own breath, ragged and shallow, filling the space around her. She took another step forward, her hand brushing against the cold, damp walls. The symbols on the walls seemed to shift and writhe as she moved, like they were alive, watching her. Her skin prickled with fear, but she couldn't stop. Then, a low, guttural sound broke the silence. A slow, dragging sound, like something heavy being moved across the floor. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her heart hammered in her chest, and she turned, fear gripping her as she saw the figure in the chair stir. It wasn't a person, not anymore. What had once been human was now a twisted, grotesque form, its body contorted in unnatural ways. The thing in the chair didn't have a face, only a black, gaping hole where its eyes should have been. Its mouth was wide open, but no sound came from it, only darkness. And then, from that darkness, a voice. It wasn't a voice like Mark's or anything human. It was deep, hollow, and ancient. "You should not have come." Emily backed away, her heart racing, her mind screaming at her to run. But her legs wouldn't move. The shadows around her grew thicker, pressing in from all sides, wrapping themselves around her body, suffocating her. "You are mine now," the voice echoed in her head, and she gasped, clutching her chest, struggling to breathe. The thing in the chair stood, its movements jerky, unnatural, like a marionette being controlled by an unseen hand. It reached for her with long, bony fingers, and Emily screamed, stumbling backward into the wall. She tried to turn and run, but the door was gone. The room had closed in on her, and she was trapped, alone with the thing that was no longer human. The creature's fingers brushed her arm, cold as death. She could feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on her soul, draining her of all hope. Her mind raced for an escape, but there was nothing, no way out. She had made a mistake. She shouldn't have opened that door. The creature's mouth opened wider, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and its black eyes fixed on her with a hunger that sent ice through her veins. It leaned toward her, its breath like a cold wind, and in that moment Emily knew. She was not the one who had been called. She was the one who would call it. Emily's breath was ragged, each inhale shallow and frantic. The creature in the chair had stood up, its body jerking unnaturally, like something twisted by a malevolent force. Its hollow eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment, everything else. The crumbling walls, the eerie symbols, the dust that filled the air, faded into nothing. There was only the creature and her. It moved toward her slowly, its limbs stretched in odd angles, its blackened mouth opening wider with every step. Emily's heart pounded so loudly, she thought it would burst. The cold of the room seemed to press deeper into her skin, a sensation that crawled down her spine, leaving her numb and frozen. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, but her body wouldn't obey. It was like the room itself had taken control of her, chaining her in place with an invisible force that was stronger than her will. The thing stopped just inches from her, its breath like the damp smell of rotting earth. It leaned closer, and Emily could feel its cold presence all around her. Her skin prickled, every fiber of her being screaming to escape, but she was trapped. Its black eyes stared deep into hers, and a low, hollow voice echoed in her mind. "You shouldn't have opened the door." The words wrapped around her thoughts, squeezing, tightening. The world seemed to blur, and for a moment, she couldn't tell what was real. Her body was no longer hers. It felt as if something ancient and vile, was crawling inside her skin, taking over her very soul. "You're mine now," the voice whispered again, only it was louder this time, sharper, like claws scraping against her mind. She gasped, but the air in the room had become thick, suffocating. Her lungs burned as she struggled to breathe. The creature's bony fingers reached for her, brushing against her arm. The touch was icy, as if death itself had pressed against her skin. She tried to pull away, but the room was spinning, her vision blurring. Every part of her screamed to escape, to fight, but she was caught in the creature's grasp, unable to move, unable to think. It leaned in closer, and its breath, cold and rancid, flooded her senses. It whispered again, this time, its words clear and sharp, like knives. "You opened the door. You called me." Emily's eyes snapped open wide. No, she hadn't called it. She hadn't. But somehow, she knew it was right. The door, the room, the whispers in the hall. They had all led her here. This thing, this creature, had been waiting for her. Her chest tightened as the realization settled over her like a heavy shroud. She had been drawn into this nightmare by forces she couldn't understand. She was trapped. The creature had claimed her, and now there was no escape. The thing moved closer still, its face now inches from hers, its black, soulless eyes burning into hers with a hunger that sent a wave of nausea through her stomach. Its mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, glistening with something dark and wet. And then, its mouth was at her ear, and she heard it clearly, "You will never leave." A cold wave of terror washed over her, as if the words themselves were a curse, sealing her fate. Suddenly, the room seemed to shift. The walls began to close in on her, the shadows stretching and warping as the air grew colder, heavier. The darkness around them pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, like a heartbeat. The creature's grip tightened on her arm, sending waves of icy terror through her body. Emily fought to move, to scream, but her throat was dry, her voice strangled. She could barely think as the room seemed to collapse around her. The floor felt unstable, as if it might give way at any moment. The shadows twisted and turned, pulling at her, stretching the walls until they seemed to ripple like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. And through it all, the creature's low, mocking laughter filled the air. "You are mine," it whispered again, but this time it wasn't just in her mind. Its voice was physical, pressing against her ears like a cold, suffocating fog. "You will stay, forever." Emily's pulse raced as the darkness swallowed her whole, and for a brief moment, she thought she might lose her mind, trapped in a world where there was no escape. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the horrible, twisting shadows, but when she opened them again, everything had changed. The room, the creature, it was gone. She was standing in an unfamiliar hallway, one she didn't recognize. The walls were cracked and peeling, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and dust. There was no sign of the twisted thing that had been in the room, and yet, she felt its presence. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The whispers in her mind were louder now, echoing around her. "She's here." The voice, faint but unmistakable, came from the shadows. Emily's legs shook, but she forced herself to move. She had no choice. She had to find a way out of this house, this nightmare that seemed to twist and change every time she blinked. The whispers followed her, seeping into her thoughts, growing louder with every step she took. The house felt alive, like it was watching her, waiting for her to make another mistake. And as Emily walked down the dim hallway, she knew that the thing in the room wasn't gone. It was still here, still watching, still waiting. And this time, it would not let her go. Emily's legs felt like jelly as she stumbled through the narrow, decaying hallway. The air around her was thick, suffocating, pressing in on her from all sides. The house had changed. It wasn't the same place she had stepped into days ago. The walls seemed to shift, stretching and contracting as though the house itself was alive, breathing, waiting. She could hear the whispers again, more clearly now. It was as though the house itself was speaking to her, its voice hissing through the cracks and crevices in the walls. "You can't run from me." Her heart raced, but she couldn't stop moving. She needed to get out. She had to find a way out. The thing, whatever it was, had marked her. She knew it. She could feel it in her bones. It was watching her, waiting for the moment when she would finally break. The whispers grew louder, like a chorus of voices, all speaking at once. The words were indistinct, but the message was clear. She was not alone. Emily paused, her breath catching in her throat. She had to make a choice. There were two paths ahead of her. One led to the staircase she had seen earlier, the other to a door she hadn't noticed before. The door was old, its wooden surface worn and cracked, but something about it drew her in. There was an odd pull, like a magnet calling her to it. She didn't want to go through the door. Every instinct screamed at her to turn and run, but her feet carried her toward it. She reached for the handle, her fingers trembling as she touched it. The cold metal burned her skin, sending a jolt of electricity through her body. It was as if the door itself had a life of its own, feeding off her fear. With a deep breath, she twisted the handle and pushed the door open. The room beyond was pitch black, so dark that she couldn't see a thing. She hesitated, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. But the whispers, they were louder now, urgent, angry. They seemed to be coming from within the room. She stepped inside, her footfall echoing in the emptiness. The door slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, and she jumped, her body going stiff with terror. "You shouldn't have opened it." The voice was not a whisper anymore. It was clear, sharp, and filled with rage. The temperature in the room plummeted. She could see her breath now, white puffs in the cold air, but there was no light, nothing to guide her. She tried to move, to find her way out, but the room was suffocatingly silent. Then, suddenly, she heard it, the softest sound, like a rustle in the darkness. Emily froze. Something moved. Her eyes strained to see anything in the blackness, but there was nothing, just shadows. Yet she could feel something, a presence, lurking just beyond her sight. The floor creaked underfoot. She dared not move, afraid that even the slightest sound would provoke whatever was hiding in the dark. Then, a cold hand brushed her arm. She gasped, spinning around, but there was nothing there. The room felt like it was closing in on her, its walls pressing in from all sides. Her chest tightened as she struggled to breathe, panic creeping in. "Leave." The voice was low and guttural, like a growl coming from the deepest part of the earth. "It's too late." The darkness swirled around her, thick and oppressive, and then, suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows. Emily gasped, her knees giving out beneath her as the creature stepped forward, its form dark and undefined, like a mass of shifting shadows. She could feel its eyes on her, burning through the darkness. Its presence was like an unbearable weight on her chest, suffocating her. It moved closer, its body sliding through the shadows like liquid. Emily could feel the coldness in the air around it, as though the very room had turned to ice. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it repeated, its voice now filled with malice. Emily tried to move, but her body refused to obey. Her limbs were frozen, heavy, as though the air had thickened to molasses. She couldn't escape. "You're mine now," the creature hissed, its voice rising to a scream. Suddenly, the shadows around her seemed to come alive, twisting and writhing like snakes. They reached for her, pulling at her legs, at her arms, dragging her toward the center of the room. The creature loomed above her, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light, a sickly yellow that burned through the darkness. Emily screamed, but the sound was lost in the thick air, swallowed by the room itself. The shadows pulled tighter, wrapping around her like chains. Her lungs burned, but she couldn't breathe. "No one leaves," the creature hissed, its face now inches from hers. She could feel its cold breath, thick with the scent of decay, on her skin. No one. Her mind was a blur. The room spun around her, and the darkness pressed in, suffocating her. She tried to fight back, to scream, but her voice was lost in the thick air. The shadows tightened, pulling her further into their grip. She was going to die here. Just as the darkness closed in, something flickered in her mind. A memory, a flash of light, a way out. In that moment of clarity, Emily reached deep inside herself, finding a strength she didn't know she had. She gathered every ounce of willpower she had left, and with one final scream, she fought back against the shadows, against the creature. With a burst of strength, she broke free from their grasp and ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The room seemed to warp around her, shifting, but she kept moving forward, toward the door she had come through. As she reached the door, she felt the creature's presence behind her, heard its growl, but she didn't stop. She wrenched the door open and stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath, her skin slick with cold sweat. But the darkness was still there, following her, whispering her name. "You can't escape," the voice said. She slammed the door shut behind her, but the whispers continued, echoing in her mind. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled down the hallway, her legs unsteady beneath her. The house was alive, shifting around her, its walls groaning with an unnatural energy. Every step she took seemed to echo through the empty halls, but the whispers, those haunting, insistent whispers, were louder than ever, surrounding her. "You can't run." Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't stop. She had to get out. She had to escape before it was too late. The creature, the thing that had followed her, was still in the house, and it wouldn't stop until it had her. She didn't know where to go. Every hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her, doors opening and closing at random, like the house was mocking her, leading her in circles. But there was one thing she knew for sure. She couldn't go back to that room. The forgotten room. "Leave. It's already too late," the voice whispered again, colder this time. It sent a chill down her spine, making her blood run cold. The house felt suffocating, as though it was closing in on her, trapping her. She could hear footsteps now, soft, measured, a slow, deliberate pace. The thing was coming. It was closer. She had no time left. Her eyes darted around the hallway, searching for anything that could give her a way out. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air thick with the scent of decay. The windows were covered, dark curtains that blocked out any hope of light. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of her own frantic breathing. Then she saw it. At the end of the hallway, a door, different from the others. It was old, weathered, but it seemed to glow faintly in the dark. There was something about it that felt right, something that pulled her toward it. Without thinking, she ran. Her feet hit the floor hard as she sprinted down the corridor, her heart racing faster with each step. She could hear the whispers again, louder this time, almost like they were mocking her. "It's useless." She ignored the voice, her hand reaching for the doorknob. She could feel the cold metal under her fingers, but this time, it wasn't as cold as before. There was something almost welcoming about it. With a quick twist, the door opened, and the world went quiet. The moment she stepped through the door, the house seemed to fall away. The dark, suffocating air was gone, replaced by a fresh breeze. Emily blinked, disoriented. The room she had entered was different. Bright, open, and filled with light. It looked nothing like the twisted halls she had just escaped. The walls were white, the windows large, and outside, she could see a garden lush and green. The peaceful sound of birds chirping filled the air. Was it a dream? Had she finally escaped? She stood there, frozen, trying to understand what was happening. But then she heard it, a soft thudding sound, like footsteps. She turned slowly, her heart sinking as she saw the figure standing in the doorway. The thing. It had followed her. It stood in the doorway, its eyes glowing, its mouth twisted into a grin. It was no longer just a shadow, it was real, and it was coming for her. "You can't run anymore," the voice said, deeper now, filled with fury. It was louder than ever before, rattling her bones. The creature stepped forward, its form shifting, twisting as though it was made of smoke and shadows. Emily backed away, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had nowhere to go. The house had followed her. No matter where she went, it would always be there, waiting. In a moment of clarity, she realized something. The house, the room, the creature, it was all one. The forgotten room hadn't just been a place. It was a part of her fear, her memories, her past. The house had fed on her terror, growing stronger with every step she took. She had to stop running. With a deep breath, she turned toward the creature, standing her ground. Her body was shaking, her mind screaming at her to run, but she refused to move. She wouldn't let it win. The creature stopped, its glowing eyes narrowing. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Emily, trembling, and the creature, waiting. "It's time to finish this," the creature growled, its form shifting again, becoming even darker, more menacing. But Emily wasn't afraid anymore. She had faced the darkness, had felt its weight pressing down on her, and she had survived. She would not let it consume her. Not now. She stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "No." The creature froze, as though her words had struck it. For a moment, the air around them felt still, as if the world itself had stopped breathing. No more. Emily didn't know what she was doing, but she knew that she had to do something. She focused all her energy on that one word, on the feeling of strength she had found within herself. She wasn't just running anymore. She was facing it. She was confronting the thing that had haunted her for so long. And then, the creature screamed. It was a sound unlike anything she had ever heard. A deafening wail that shook the very foundation of the house. It lunged forward, but Emily didn't flinch. She stood her ground, her feet planted firmly on the floor. The creature reached for her, but the closer it came, the more it seemed to disintegrate. The air around her shimmered with a strange energy, and the creature's form began to break apart, pieces of shadow dissolving into the light. Emily reached out, her hand brushing the edges of its fading form, and for a moment, she felt a jolt of cold. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. Silence. The house was still. Emily stood there, breathing heavily, unsure if she was dreaming or awake. She had done it. She had faced the darkness and won. The door behind her opened, and she stepped out into the garden. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, and the world felt normal. She was free, but as she walked away from the house, the wind whispered again, soft and distant. "You can never escape." Emily turned, but the house was gone. There was nothing left but the empty field behind her. She had finally broken the cycle, or so she thought,